Welcome back, everyone, to another story time with Brandon. I promised that I'd continue this. I haven't forgot about it. It's just been really difficult for me to get to everything when it comes to this channel, but I'm finally trying to run through everything, and this one has been sitting in my to-do list for probably almost a year. It's one of my favorite stories that I've ever written. It's a little bit longer than the other ones that I've done, but it's not too long. Um, it's a bit graphic, so viewers' discretion is advised. I think I wrote it like 3 years ago. I've only gone back and fixed a couple of grammatical errors, so I hope you all enjoy. And yeah, let's get right into this. I remember roaring laughter and choking on strong liquor with friends, throwing rotten currency on the table bet after bet in an addictive rage, stumbling home after a blurry night with an empty bottle and dusty pockets. I remember the poor city was more savage than usual that night, and the flickering streetlights represented the moon. My neighbor, a crazy old lady, was telling herself a story of a time when she was swarmed by wealthy men every day, all begging for her hand. Traveling down a familiar alley, I stomped my way up the winding staircase to my front door. Though cracked and moldy, I owned it with pride. I remember feeling a sense of repetition as I let out a sigh and fumbled with the keys. Once I found the one I thought was correct, the door opened with a violent creak. Taking one step into the shady house, I was suddenly greeted by a blunt instrument, too fast to describe. I remember feeling, seeing, and hearing nothing, but for a moment there was a very distant and quiet voice calling my name. After what I assumed was a while, there was numbness in my body. Realizing my being unconscious, my eyes slowly rolled open to a scene in which I will never forget. I remember the details of her face to this day, as if she was an artist creating a bold new painting. Her hazel brown eyes were fixed on me, but they were not looking at me. Her pale and bruised face bared streaks of dried tears that ran down her soft cheeks. Her short brown hair was pulled back, but her face remained in that still, broken expression, as a blurry silhouette of a person who I just realized was behind her brought a well-polished blade up to her neck and slit her throat open. I remember thinking I was in a dream. I didn't scream or cry as my wife was murdered before my very eyes, nor did I feel any pain when I looked around the candlelit room. On the other side of the dusty wooden floor was two small, horribly mangled bodies, disfigured well beyond the point of recognition. I remember slowly feeling around my body, still dizzy from waking up. I was sitting on the floor, my hands were tied to something behind my back, and my face was bleeding. I was shocked at how real the dream felt, but I knew it wasn't, on account of my inability to feel several things, including pain in my face. I remember the first words you said to me. "Good evening," you announced as you dropped my wife's naked corpse on the ground in front of me. Her eyes were still open in that disgusting expression as gallons of thick blood oozed out her neck, filling in the grooves on the floor and gradually inching closer toward me, surrounding my pant leg. I remember I couldn't smell a thing, nor feel the fabric of my clothes or the weight of the air. I guess you could call it a numb feeling I had, but that didn't describe it just right. It was more like I never realized those feelings were supposed to be there to begin with. I remember you walked out of the room, then back in a few seconds later. You grabbed one of the candles from on top my desk where I would spend days writing arrogant novels about today's standard of living and letters addressed to my cutthroat friends and greedy business partners. You walked right over to me and knelt to my level. I remember your face, exposed by the orange candlelight. You pushed your greasy, unkempt hair back and let out a sigh, then blinked rapidly with a maniacal grin. "Hi, name's Sam," you announced with an untroubled tone. I remember the first emotional feeling I felt after waking up. I felt agitated and wanted to get out of the damn dream already. "Do you know how I can wake up?" I asked you. I remember your laugh as you placed your blood-stained hand on my shoulder and rubbed your eyes, slightly gasping for air. "You think you're dreaming?" you asked. After I replied with a nod, you grabbed my head and tapped it several times with the bloody knife. I remember you pointed my face at my dead wife and said, "That is your real wife." She was screaming and crying as I raped her, broke her spirit. She gave a fight, but most of the time she was begging for you to wake up. She stopped all that after them, I suppose. You pulled my head up and pointed it across the room at the other gory scene. "You see those bodies? Can you figure out who they were? Come on, they were your children. They squealed like pigs as I flayed the skin clean off their bodies. Then, I had a nutritious snack, so to speak." I remember not feeling a thing. No sadness, no guilt, no remorse, no anger. There was nothing as you explained what happened. I remember you looked into my eyes and asked, "Do you really not realize what has happened here?" "This is getting old. Wake me up now," I replied. After a minute of you just staring in my eyes, you leaned over and whispered in my ear, "As you wish." I remember the second thing I really felt after waking up. It was an extremely painful sting, then a burning and pulsating pain that caused me to scream. The blade slid gracefully through my skin and between my ribs with no resistance at all, proof of both its sharpness and quality. I remember thinking that it felt too damn real for a dream and trying to figure out how it was possible. Once the blade was deep inside my body, you twisted it left and right, causing my body to tense in the direction of the blade. I screamed and cursed as the pain coursed through my entire being. I remember thinking I would rather be dead than feel this pain any longer. "Are you awake yet?" you yelled as you dropped the candle and dipped your hand in the pool of blood on the floor. Smearing my wife's blood on my face as you laughed hysterically, my stomach suddenly felt extremely sick and I got a splitting headache. I remember yelling, "Stop! Please stop!" on instinct. Your laughing ceased and you pulled the blade out quickly. You stared at me with anticipation as I panted fast and heavily, and my eyes widened. I remember the third feeling I felt. After realizing that I was still sitting here on my bloody floor, this person was still kneeling in front of me, my wife still had that dead expression on her face, the mangled bodies were still in the corner, the candles were still flickering around the house, my body was still in pain as tears fell down my face and the air felt like it was sucked out of the room. Definitely awake. I suddenly felt an immeasurable amount of energy and strength course through my body, and one thing was on my mind. I remember ramming my head against yours like a sledgehammer and kicking you back across the room with ease. I violently lifted the large wooden table behind me with little effort and flipped it backwards, sliding the knot down the part I was tied to. Blood flowing out of my body, I rushed over to you as you were getting your balance and slammed you against the wall, knocking the knife out of your hand. I remember your face was bleeding as you turned, punching me over and over. Not feeling a thing, I finally ducked under your punch and kicked your legs from under you, causing you to fall. After landing on your side, I lifted one of my legs to stomp your head, but you grabbed my other leg and tripped me to the ground as well. I remember that was the first thing I felt after going berserk, and started feeling sore from my face and my stab wound. You quickly jumped on top of me and shoved your thumb deep into my left eye, squishing it entirely as blood came rushing out. I screamed intensely as my vision went black after you crushed the other and I felt my body getting weak again. I remember your rough fingers wrapping around my neck. Even though I wanted to scream in agony, I couldn't. I felt helpless as I gasped under the crushing feeling and my body began to shake uncontrollably. I remember my mind began to fade in and out of consciousness. One moment everything was black, my body was burning in pain, and all I could do was attempt to gasp for air, and the next moment I was somewhere else, perfectly fine with my wife and kids. It was hazy at first, but I soon realized I was perfectly fine. My wife, children, and I were in a bedroom. A shimmering morning glare was beaming through a window to my left, illuminating the room. I remember my son was at the foot of the long bed holding a large dog with short black and white fur. Both were sound asleep. My sweet little daughter was quietly drawing away on an old wooden table I got from my parents' house after it burned down. After watching her for a while, I noticed the details in her hair. I could distinguish each golden strand from the next while admiring the brilliant glow they produced from the sun's rays. I remember she hopped off the big, dark wood chair and rubbed her eyes with an adorable yawn. Holding her drawing in one hand, she crept over to the slumbering boy and poked at his face. After he woke up, she whispered to him. I remember much giggling and scheming between the two before they climbed up the bed to my wife and me. With childish smiles on their faces, my son counted down to 1, sending both in a surprising frenzy. With laughing and giggling, the two were yelling, get up, come on, Mom, wake up, Dad." I remember sitting up with a groan as my wife laughed and picked up my daughter, tickling her too with an inhuman cackle. I smiled and watched my small family, no worry, no regret, no hate. I felt at ease, completely tranquil, just enjoying the moment. I remember my wife stopped and looked at me, followed by my children. They stared with unchanging faces, almost creepily. As I went to say something, my wife spoke. "Dear, didn't you hear the kids? It's time to wake up." I remember her voice was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. Calm, smooth, soft. Her words repeated in my head over and over again as the scene around me began to change. The gleaming sunlight was slowly dimmed as the air around me became thin and hard to swallow. I remember choking in the dark room with my family staring at me, smiles on their faces. My mind began to go blank and I started to see the darkness again and feel the burning. I placed a hand on my aching head and looked up. The last thing I think I saw was my daughter's drawing. It said, "Be good, Daddy." I remember an instant later I was back in the room with you. I frantically slipped my hands out of the ropes constricting them and attempted to pry yours off my neck as I held my breath. Panicking, I squirmed and wiggled in a desperate attempt to break free of your grasp. I remember pain in my head, my eyes, my side, my neck. I also remember hearing my wife's voice again. What she told me before was still echoing in my head. As my life was spiraling to a close, you leaned in and whispered in my ear, "You can't get away that easily." I remember jolting up, menacing laughter echoing and fading into the distance as I blankly stared at my surroundings. In front of me was the winding staircase leading up to my prideful front door. Behind me was a crazy old woman laughing and talking to herself. It took me a moment, but I eventually realized that I was laying face first in the muddy alley leading up to my home. I remember trying to figure out what was going on and how I'd got there. Without thinking, I rushed up those wooden stairs, tripping twice and knocked down the door. Once I had entered my home, I was caught with a splitting headache, but it did not stop me from screaming their names. I remember yelling, "Mary, Amber, Jordan," so loud it probably woke up half the city. Like a mindless animal, I threw boxes, chairs, and any other furniture out of my way as I worriedly ran from room to room searching without a second thought. Once I made it back to the living room, I stopped, remembering the horrible nightmare in explicit detail. I remember noticing a piece of paper on my desk, one that I didn't see before. I could not help the river of tears that fell from my face as I crept over to that note, fearfully wondering what it would say. "Goodbye, Samuel. We're leaving for good this time. Don't follow us. Don't try to find us." I remember losing the ability to stand and falling onto the floor, sobbing with the note tightly clenched in my hand. Through the painful cries and moans, one could make out 2 words being repeated by me. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." It wasn't long after that you came again, silently creeping out of the darkness. This time you placed your hand on my shoulder and smiled. "Oh, Sam, poor, poor Sam. Don't you remember? Who's the real monster here, hmm?" After those words fell out your mouth and caressed my ears, I laid the note on the floor and reached up to the drawer of my desk, opening it. Inside was nothing but empty space and a familiar, well-polished knife.